Well, good evening. Well, welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible study. We're in the book of Ezra this evening, in the first chapter. We'll read starting in verse 5 in just a second. And what we'll be reading about is the first return of the children of Israel to Jerusalem after the exile. Now, the exile was still continuing for many. The scattering of the Jewish people after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem was something that would be permanent in some ways. The Jews would be scattered all around the world from that time to this. They'd be scattered again more thoroughly after the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. But there was a beginning of a return to the Jews, to Israel, a second Exodus in a way. That's a very important term in Jewish history, Exodus. It speaks primarily of the Israelites leaving Egypt and the slavery to go to the promised land for the first time. But here we have echoes of this in this passage in the book of Ezra. And then you might remember the Leon Uris book that in this Exodus about the coming of the Jews into Palestine in modern times. This idea of leaving captivity or leaving a foreign land and returning home is a very important one in this book and in the story of Judaism. So let's read Ezra chapter 1. We're going to start reading in verse 5. So the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, let's stop right there. Judah and Benjamin were the two tribes that comprised the people of Judea or Judah, the kingdom of Judah that was the southern kingdom after the kingdom that David built split in two after the reign of Solomon. You'll recall that the 10 northern tribes comprised the kingdom of Israel, or it was often called Samaria after its capital. And the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, comprised the nation of Judah. And so when it says that those returning were the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, it lets us know, though we'll see later on that there were some members of the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Ephraim contained within this group later, this first return was something that was brought through the house of Judah, the house of Benjamin, and the Levites, the priests, and the leaders of worship. So the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and the Levites, I just said that, everyone whose spirit God had roused. Now that phrase is the most important phrase in this passage, and one of the most important phrases of the whole book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah that will follow, because what we see in the story of the resurrection, as it were, of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, and the reestablishment of Jerusalem as the home of the people of Judea, is the story of God's working. This was always in God's plan. God had brought them into exile as a chastisement for their faithlessness and the way they had turned to false idols. He brought them back from exile, and they were faithful. And there, that faithful people would be the home from which Jesus would come. Always part of God's plan. So this is God's moving, bringing about here. You'll recall from last week, I hope, that Cyrus the Great, the emperor of the Persians, had been moved by God to decree that the Israelites should be able to return home, that they should rebuild the temple, rebuild their worship of God. And God is moving not only through Cyrus, but through the leaders of the people and through their neighbors and friends, we'll see in a moment, to reestablish a worshiping community. You see, that's important to God. That there would always be people who would gather together to remember Him, to praise Him, to honor Him, to worship Him. A worshiping community. And by the way, God doesn't change. And if it was important for there to be a worshiping community then, it's important for there to be a worshiping community now. That's one of the things we struggled with during this coronavirus pandemic. These things we're doing on video are great, and I hope that you're watching them in your living room or in your bedroom or your sun porch or out by the pond, wherever you are. I hope you watch them and you get something out of them. But they are not a replacement for coming together as the people of God, being part of that worshiping community in the church, whatever church you belong to. It's essential that we have those connections with each other, that we're strengthened by our worshiping together. It is important that we are a part of a community. That's what God was building throughout the story of the Old Testament, leading up to this point where he's reestablishing the worshiping community of Israel. Now, there were Israelites who still worshiped God alone. We see in the book of Daniel, we have these image of Daniel opening the windows toward Jerusalem and worshiping and praying. Got him in trouble. Got him sent to a lion's den. But he was alone in that. And yes, we can worship God alone. But there's something important that happens when we worship God in community. Everyone whose spirit God had roused prepared to go up and rebuild the Lord's house in Jerusalem. Their return to Jerusalem, their return to Judea, was not simply a political return to rebuild a nation. It was not, they weren't going there to reestablish the kingdom of the house of David. They weren't going there to just go back home. Most of them had been born in Babylon. They had Babylonian names. They dressed in Babylonian customs. They were going back to rebuild the temple of the Lord, to reestablish the worship of God. Because here's the truth. God is more important than any nation. God is more important than any country, than any system of government. He is the ruler of all things, and our purpose is to worship him. And so God has moved the conqueror of the Babylonians, the great Emperor Cyrus, one of the greatest military and civic rulers in the history of the world, has moved Cyrus to rebuild his temple so that God's people can reestablish the worship of the one true God. God moves through time, and he moves through history to his glory's sake. All their neighbors supported them with silver, articles, golds, goods, livestock, and valuables, in addition to all that was given as a freewill offering. You might remember from last week, Cyrus had decreed that the neighbors, and these are not the Jewish neighbors, these are the Babylonian neighbors, would give an offering to the Jews to help them to go and to do this. And they're doing so willingly because they are being moved by God as well to give silver and gold and livestock and goods and valuable things so that when they get there, they might have the means to reestablish the temple, to reestablish their community of worship. King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and had placed in the house of his gods. God had moved Cyrus not only to restore Israel, but to even restore the items that had been taken from the temple of Solomon that Nebuchadnezzar had placed in the house of his gods as a picture that his gods were over the gods of Israel. And Cyrus had brought them out of that captivity. Not only were the people in captivity, But the items of the temple, the holy things, were in captivity to the Babylonians, and Cyrus restored them to Judah, that the worship of Jehovah might be restored. God's not just moving the people, he's moving the king. He's moving the neighbors. He's moving the bureaucrats. King Cyrus of Persia had them brought out under the supervision of Mithridath, the treasurer. So this Persian man, ordered by Cyrus, is willingly bringing these things out, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. A word about Sheshbazzar. We don't know where he came from, and he disappears into history. His name is Babylonian. He was probably born in Babylon during the exile. He was probably not an old man. He was probably middle-aged. But he was a prince of Judah, and that meant he was somehow connected with the royal line. It doesn't mean he was going there to be king. He was not. There was a satrap, a Persian ruler over that whole region, and there were governors over the smaller regions within the satrapies. And so he wasn't going to be king, but he was part of the royal family. That same royal family that Jesus was born from. Sheshbazzar brought all of them when the exiles went up from Babylon to Jerusalem. What an amazing thing this is. God moving a pagan king, pagan people, to bring about the return of his people to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. Now, it would take them a long time to do it. Sheshbazzar and his followers, and chapter 2 includes all the followers. That's a little bit of a slog through chapter 2. But Sheshbazzar and those who went with him opened the breach. They established the groundwork. And it would come 80 years later for Ezra to come in, and then later yet Nehemiah to come in and to really get the work moving. But they were the pioneers. They were the ones moved by God to achieve God's purposes. And this is what we need to grasp from this. When God moves, everything moves. God moved his people. They heard the command from Cyrus, and they were willing and ready and desiring to go to obey. God moved his people. God moved the king of the Persians. God moved the neighbors and the friends. God moved everything. So my brothers and sisters, when the Lord is moving in your life, go. Go with him. Or when you see God moving in a family member, or moving in a friend, or moving in the church, don't try to stand in the way and say, well, this isn't the way we've done things. God sometimes does things in new ways. Move with God. When God is moving in the nation, support it. Help it. Don't stand in the way. You know, these neighbors of the Israelites, they had lived in Babylon their whole lives, and Babylon had always been a certain way, and it was not like that anymore. It was now something entirely different, because God was moving powerfully. And they moved with it. They gave their silver and their gold and their valuable things and their livestock to help their neighbors who were moved by God. And sometimes to facilitate the moving of the Lord, we must give. When God moves, move with him. Or he might just move over you. Move with him. And friends, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. God still moves. I hope you have a good night tonight. If you have a prayer request, you can send it in to us at bellavistabcprayer@gmail.com. We will respond and let you know that we're praying for you. If you want to come join us Sunday morning, we're here at 8:15, 10:45. You need to wear your mask. We socially distance. We're trying to keep people from being moved by coronavirus. We love you. We miss you. And we hope you